All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. It is September 8th, 2022. I am Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is a status conference on water right application 30166 filed by El Sur Ranch for a permit to appropriate water from the Big Sur River in Monterey County. This status conference is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and video are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording along with the Zoom generated transcript to the AHO FTP site. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If at any time you are experiencing technical difficulties trying to communicate with us, please send an email to the AHO at adminhrgoffice@waterboards.ca.gov. AHO staff are monitoring that email inbox and will let me know. Assisting me today are several such staff of the Administrative Hearings Office. We have Nicole Mullen, Amy Blunk, Skylar Anderson, and Kyle Wooldridge. I would like to go ahead and move to appearances. I think we've done this several times, but just to reiterate, I will identify each entity that is filed in NOI. And as I do, if you are representing that entity today, please unmute your microphone and state your name. I did want to add, because I think in this matter, we will be having fairly frequent status conferences. It is, of course, not required for all parties to participate in the status conferences. You are welcome to participate or not to participate. And of course, those recordings are available to you. So if you're not able to join us, you can review the status conference at your leisure using the various links on the AHO YouTube page or in our AHO FTP folder. So with that, I will go ahead and start with the applicant, El Sur Ranch, and James J. Hill.
Good morning, this is Julianne Ainsley. I see that with me is Mr. Berliner.
Morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Ainsley and Mr. Berliner. And Mr. Berliner, I could see that you were attempting to go for the unmute there. Looks like you found it. Thank you. And then we move next to CSPA.
Chris Schutz for the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Schutz. Center for Biological Diversity. Ventana Wilderness Alliance. Trout Unlimited. Carmel River Steelhead Association.
Ryan Leneve for the Carmel River Steelhead Association.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Leneve.
Good morning.
And I have on my list Monterey Waterkeeper, but I did receive an email which is available on the AHO FTP site that Ms. Tu will not be joining us today, but they did file an NOI, just to bring that to all of your attention. And we've amended, I believe we've amended our service list accordingly. California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Good morning, Katie Miller for CDFW and joined by Nancy Murray.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Miller and Ms. Murray. California Department of Parks and Recreation.
Good morning, this is Emma Severson representing State Parks.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Severson. And then I believe they will not be joining us today, but did file an NOI, and that is National Marine Fisheries Service. Is there anyone else who intends to participate today who has not had a chance to identify themselves?
Yes, Ms. Kunze, Mark Blum for El Sur Ranch.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Blum.
Good morning.
So I think the purpose of the status conference today is several. First of all, I guess I'll note that I did receive status conference statements from El Sur Ranch, thank you, and also from CDFW, so I appreciate those. They're also available and saved in the record. On my agenda for today, I think first we might talk briefly about what I'm loosely calling a CEQA consultant, a consultant for the whatever CEQA compliance document may be needed in this situation. And then just a follow-up on our communication policy, if you will, about any questions that may come up related to the amendments to the application or other procedural or substantive matters. The next on my list is just to check in on the measurement and reporting proposal, and following on that with the discussion of mediation topics. And just to make sure that we're on track for moving that forward, I think we have a future deadline on the mediation topics, but we'll check in on those. And then last, I will turn to the room to see if there are any other procedural issues we should talk about today. And then finally, I'd like to set a follow-up status conference so that we know when we're meeting again. So first, maybe I will turn to you, Ms. Ainsley or Mr. Berliner. I know the last we talked at our last status conference, which was just maybe 2 weeks ago, you had asked about a consultant list. We just provided the general State Water Board list of water rights consultants. And then I did appreciate your follow-up email, Mr. Berliner, indicating that you were looking into whether the consultant who was used for the prior CEQA document in this matter would be available and could gear up. So I just wanted to check in on that and see if you had any other follow-up or issues that we should address at this time.
No, I've been attempting to locate the people that actually did the work last time, thinking there would be less of a learning curve, and I have not yet been successful, but that I've called twice, and I'll persist and try to get somebody lined up.
Thank you. Thank you for that report. Is there anything else we need to talk about, Mr. Berliner, related to communication on any amendments to the application itself, which we currently have a deadline of November 1st for getting that into the division, and I wanted to check in on your status there and whether there's anything we need to discuss at this time.
So there's not any particular technical questions at the moment. I did talk to Provost and Pritchard and asked them, were there things they wanted to communicate with the water board and with the engineering staff? And they said, well, normally as a matter of routine, when they're about to submit an application, their practice is to meet with water board engineers and get feedback. Is this clear enough? Do you need anything else? And okay, we know what you want. When we submit, here's what we'll do. So they just raised that issue that would be normally how they would do it, and they would communicate directly with staff engineers to make sure that the application was understandable and had everything in it that they would want to see, so that it was it would try to eliminate the back and forth on questions. But so that's just the extent of the conversation that I had with them. And we can, at whatever you decide as to how to proceed, my concern would be, of course, submitting an application in November that had some questions in it, and then how do we work back and forth and all that. But whatever you think would be appropriate under whatever applicable rule we're operating under.
Well, this is what I'm thinking, Mr. Berliner. I wonder if it makes sense to submit I don't know what we call it, but a draft version of I think this will be a petition for change to the application. And that may have the benefit of eliminating the need to further revise the petition if there are concerns that come up. I mean, I think it may be an efficient way to move through this, and then we could look at the November 1st deadline as a deadline for submission of what we'd call a draft, not formal submission to the State Water Board, but submission to the AHO of a draft. My commitment from our office would be to respond and raise any concerns. Other parties would have an opportunity to respond. I don't want to get into the substance of arguing, whether on the merits of the petition itself, but just if there are concerns about understanding what the petition proposes to do, and there would be a chance to make those changes. Do you think that is something that would be helpful and efficient, Or is this just introducing another step in the process that might not be necessary?
I don't know the answer to that
Okay.
particular question. I'm going to operate under the assumption that we would normally, just because we've been, in settlement negotiations and there's parties that have all agreed to various conditions, that the idea of submitting a draft to me makes sense so that everybody is assured that we're operating consistently with what we said we were going to do. And that would give everybody a chance if something was unclear again. And then some of it, of course, is quite technical related to the reservoir. And that's just, I really can't answer questions about that. We would need engineers to do that. I mean, they have certain requirements and because of the location of where it is, and they've been talking to Monterey County, and I assume they've been talking to the Coastal Commission as well. So if that was needed, then we'd have to figure out how to proceed. But otherwise, in terms of submitting the draft and getting any feedback that people might have, it makes sense to me.
Thank you. I think on that point, I'll turn to the room. Does anyone here care to comment on the proposal that the applicant would initially submit a draft version of what I think will be a petition to change the pending application? Or are there other concerns about anything that you would like to raise on that process? Well, from my perspective today, I think that makes sense to essentially what I do is amend that November 1st deadline to indicate that this would be a draft with the understanding that the intent would be it would be a complete draft, but a draft and would not require submittal by November 1st to the Division of Water Rights. And then we could set a deadline given the commitment that my team would provide any comments we may have if there are concerns about the content of the draft. And parties would have a chance to respond to that, and then we'd set a deadline out at some point to actually submit that change petition to the division formally, and then formalize that change. So my intent.
Let me just get, if I could, some clarification on that. When you say your staff, so would that be consulting with the engineers that normally process the applications, or is that just AHO staff?
We have we have technical expertise within the AHO office. So I would consult with them, and if they thought appropriate or necessary, then they may reach out to division staff who have, of course, additional expertise in processing applications. So we would make that decision based on what we think is appropriate at the time.
Okay.
Is there anything else on this general topic of moving forward on the amended application and identifying a CEQA consultant, those issues, before I move over to measurement and reporting?
This is Mark Blum speaking. I guess I do have a question. This process that we're talking about where the AHO staff will review the draft application, is that in lieu of Provost and Pritchard working with the water board engineers as they would normally do, or in addition to that?
That would be, thank you, Mr. Bloom. That would be in lieu of. So we're operating here under the ex parte prohibition on ex parte communications. And this application at this time is being processed entirely through our office. So any conversations that are had between your engineering consultants, Provost and Pritchard, and either AHO staff or division staff would have to be done on the record. So either in writing or during a status conference like this. So it would be a process that would be in lieu of these informal communications that might otherwise occur in processing a water right application. Does that address your question?
It does. Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
One question, I guess a couple questions, and I think you answered one of them, is that we would want a deadline for the final application if this is a draft by November 1st. And it may be a good idea to have some kind of a status conference in between the draft and final. If there are technical questions, our people might have questions also. So while we would appreciate that, there would be your technical staff talking to the ranch's technical staff, our technical staff might have questions also. It might be most productive to have those all happen at the same time in between the draft and the final, if that works timing wise.
Thank you, Ms. Murray. I think that makes a lot of sense. My intent here is we're going to set out several status conferences. We won't set the dates necessarily today, but we will have follow-up status conferences, and likely it sounds like it makes sense to me to have one in between the draft deadline and whatever the final deadline is. I think another topic of conversation that will come up once we receive a draft is this question about what procedures our office would need to take if we need to renotice the application, which based on my reading of the regulations at this point seems highly likely. So that would be another procedural point that we would likely want to talk about between receiving the draft, so we have a sense of what is happening and whatever is submitted in final form.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? So on the measurement and reporting proposal, let's move to that. And this is for the voluntary interim bypass flows that the applicant has stated that it's complying with from the based on the settlement agreement that's in place. My understanding is that the applicant's representatives and CDFW's representatives were able to discuss. And I think based on the report that there was an agreement on El Sur Ranch's reporting of diversions from the wells and the timing of that reporting as an interim matter while we work through this application. But that there was a disagreement about the meaning of the settlement agreement, which is a little bit of a separate issue than just the measurement and reporting. But maybe I'll turn first to Mr. Berliner or Ms. Ainsley and ask if my understanding is accurate. And then I'll turn to you, Ms. Murray.
Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, I think your understanding is accurate. We are going to prepare a simple chart and probably in an Excel or spreadsheet type format and provide that to the department and to anybody else that wants to see it on a regular basis. And I think we've come to agreement on that. So we're moving forward to prepare that. Mr. Hill has had a chance to take a look at it. We're just trying to prepare an Excel spreadsheet that will do the math automatically. And then he'll try it and make sure it works for him. And assuming it's actually successfully operating, then we'll just go ahead and be providing the numbers as we've agreed to with the department.
Good, thank you. Ms. Murray or Ms. Miller, I'll turn to you. Do you have any comments on the measurement and reporting proposal?
The only comment I had on the reporting proposal is, and it might have been some crosswires. We had discussed reporting weekly through October, but I think maybe we said up to October. In any case, CFW would prefer the weekly reporting just to extend through October. That's still a critical time for rearing of juvenile steelhead, and we typically don't see flows increase on the river until the rainy season begins in November. So just an extension of that reporting period through October.
Does anyone else care to chime in on this topic? Mr. Schutz.
Yes, and maybe I'm I hope I'm not adding confusion. I am a little confused about your reference to a settlement agreement. Were you talking about what I understand is kind of an informal agreement between the department and Elser Ranch about how Elser Ranch is operating in the interim between the hearing as it occurred in 2011 and the resolution of this matter? Or was there some other settlement agreement that you were referring to?
I am referring to the settlement agreement, the 2019 settlement agreement. It is not clear to me. I'm struggling with what to call it, so I've just been calling it a settlement agreement, but it's not clear to me whether it's a draft or whether it's fully executed or what exactly it is at this point, although I don't think I need to fully understand that until we get to the point of a hearing in this process. So I'm referring to it as a settlement agreement with those caveats that I understand that there may be some questions about how complete it is and whether or not is binding on the parties. I have no opinion on that element of it. Does that clarify, Mr. Schutz?
It helps. It might be more accurate to refer to it as a settlement proposal or something like that, because my understanding is that it's not executed. And draft settlement agreement would be another way to refer to it. That was the source of my misunderstanding.
And that, right, as I said, I've struggled with that. I think it's the settlement agreement is a defined term in the initial notice in this matter, so I've been referring to it in the same way. But your comments on that are noted. I understand that there are some outstanding questions about it. Mr. Berliner, did you want to jump in on this?
Oh, I think we're saying the same thing, that it's your reference to the settlement agreement is the document that I think we all know. There is no separate other agreement of any sort.
Thank you.
I would add that a lot of the detail is spelled out in that 2019 filing with the Water Board that's available on the Elser Ranch site if anybody doesn't have it. And it does explain the process that would be gone through to work with the Water Board to craft what would be a final formal settlement agreement, something that looked like a settlement agreement, because what we have does not, it has the elements, it just doesn't quite look like a settlement agreement. So at the time in 2019, we appreciated we needed to do a formal document. But if somebody's reading that, especially if they haven't seen it before, that document does lay out sort of the path that the parties agreed to follow.
So I think with respect to measurement and reporting, what I plan to do is memorialize the commitment by the applicant to supply this information, and I will phrase that as a direction from the AHO for information in support of the pending application. And if there are once I memorialize that, if there is any concern from any of the parties that I didn't accurately capture the nature of what you talked about in the agreement, we can address that at a follow-up status conference. But I will try to put that down in writing. I will put it down in writing in a status conference ruling after this status conference. I did want to clarify that, just so we're all on the same understanding, is that I don't understand that I have any authority in my position at this time to order the applicant to engage in any bypass or interim flows. I don't think that's within my authority. I can direct submission of information, but I can't require the applicant to cease diversions or limit diversions in any way at this time. So I did want to put that out there, that this is to some extent voluntary, or at least it's not, compliance with the interim flow measures or bypass measures are not at my direction, and I don't have the authority to direct that. Because I think there was a request from CDFW that I order some different bypass flows, and I just don't see that I have the authority to do that. So I did want to address that. Is Ms. Murray or Ms. Miller, do you want to follow up on that at all, or does that seem clear to you?
I'll just briefly say, and Ms. Miller can follow, but so just on the issue of the measurement, so we do have a little bit of back and forth yet to do with the ranch regarding the Excel spreadsheet. So your order isn't going to be so specific that wouldn't allow us to further negotiate the exact parameters of the Excel spreadsheet, correct? But it will be weekly and then monthly. I think that's enough specifics in your order. We had further discussion with one of our biologists that was out in terms of average daily. So we're still having a little back and forth on the spreadsheet itself. And then we can talk about the actual, we call it a partial draft because partial is key. There's key elements that were never agreed to and it's draft, never executed. So whether we call it a partial draft or a draft, I don't think settlement agreement is correct. And we can talk about that when we get to the next topic in terms of mediation. We understand that that mediation will be happening and that discussion of what should happen even right now should be part of that mediation.
Thank you. So yes, my intent will be to be somewhat general in this direction about the measurement and reporting. And then if down the line, there's additional specifics that should be memorialized in a procedural ruling, I can do that. We can modify it. But I thought it would be good to get something in writing so that we have a record of what has been agreed to. With that, I'm prepared to move on to mediation. If there's anything else, last call on measurement and reporting. So I think where we left things on mediation. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Schutz, please go ahead.
Yes, I didn't understand. What I understood you to say at the beginning was there was an agreement on the reporting to CDFW of the diversions, but that there was not agreement on the measurement of flow. Or did I misunderstand? And is that something that you are proposing to take up now? It is something that's mentioned in the statement of the department. And I don't know if this is the appropriate time to address that, or if you're going to pick that up later in the discussion.
I wasn't going to, so we should talk about it now. My understanding is that there's a disagreement about the meaning of the interim bypass flow in the settlement agreement or draft settlement agreement. And that could affect whether or not how the measurement at the USGS gauge should be used to determine compliance with that flow measure, right? I mean, determine compliance with that term of the agreement or draft agreement. So I see that as an issue about the substance of what should be required, what flows should be required as a minimum bypass flow at the USGS gauge. And I don't think it's within my authority to make a determination as to what that means or what the requirement should be. So I can direct Elsa Ranch, and the measurements at the USGS gauge, as Elsa Ranch has pointed out, is publicly available and we can all access them. I'm not sure there's anything else left there for me to address unless you have something in mind, Mr. Schutz.
No, I think that clarifies.
On mediation, where we left things, I asked the applicant to submit a list of mediation topics. CDFW also submitted a list of proposed mediation topics. I didn't ask for the applicant to work with everyone. I didn't know how much time you would have to work with everyone to narrow down those topics and come to some agreement. I believe in my last notice of status conferences and procedural ruling, I set a deadline of September 22nd for the applicant to submit a final list of proposed mediation topics after consulting with a meeting with the parties. So I just wanted to check in on, I'll turn to you first, Mr. Berliner, of whether you have additional conversations that you plan to have in an attempt to narrow down mediation topics or identify mediation topics, I should say. They're not whether they're narrower or larger, whatever it is. And whether you have any comments about next steps on identifying the appropriate matters for mediation.
So it is my intention to reach out to the other parties that we've been talking with about the terms of the settlement. Mr. Leneve is on the phone. Mr. Schutz is on the phone. They're among the people we've spoken with. We've had conference calls in the past to talk about terms of settlement, and they've been, we've gotten quite good progress, and everybody seemed up to speed. But that does raise a question for me, because I understood the proceeding that we are in now to be an extension of what we'd already done with the water board, and that the reference from the water board was with respect to the open issues plus the application. And we now have other parties or participants that are some who are on the call and have been on the previous call or may come on future calls. And I'm not sure of their status. Are they going to be parties that would have a role to play in the adjudication, or how is that going to work? We had a list before, a service list that identified a distinction between what I'll call parties to the proceeding and other participants overall. And we have been negotiating with the parties to the proceeding. So that's a subset. And there are people now that have shown interest that we've never spoken with.
So this gets to thank you, Mr. Berliner. I can understand that this is a challenge. I think we have a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem, right? Because I suspect, as I mentioned, that we are going to be renoticing this application, in which case there will be an opportunity for additional protests and an opportunity for additional entities to participate as parties. One option would be, before we go down the road of mediation, would be to go through that process, so that you have a further understanding of who exactly is a protestant to the application and would be participating in the remaining portion of the hearing as a party. That may make sense. I'm trying to think this through. So I think it's a question about the timing of the mediation, whether we want to do that after you have a more determined sense of who might be participating, or whether you think you may have a pretty good idea at this point, and it would be helpful to go directly to mediation essentially as soon as possible. I'm looking to all of you as to when the timing of mediation and when that would be the most productive, in your opinion.
Well, I don't want to have to mediate twice.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So, when this came out, I just, to be quite transparent about it, my expectation was that we have these open issues, and the parties that had been participating all along and have been part of the discussion would be participating, if they wished, in the mediation, and that we would try to resolve these outstanding terms. And frankly, I've been making an effort to try to do that already, and had planned to raise over the next couple of weeks that we have, raise those issues again and see to what extent we can come to agreement on those issues, at least either in an attempt to avoid mediation completely because we've resolved them, or narrow it down to whatever the open issues still are. So I was going to try to take advantage of that between now and the 22nd. And then I do have the understanding that if the application needs to be renoticed, that would represent a substantial change if somebody else decided they wanted to participate in the proceedings. And so we would have to find out what their concerns are and deal with that. My goal, of course, would be to try to resolve all of those as expeditiously as possible. mediation's a burden on everybody. If we do it once and we come to a successful agreement, and then we notice an application later, we have a group of people that have already come to agreement, and now we have protestants. That to me seems difficult. I don't really have any strong ideas on how to handle this. Logically, it sort of seems like it would be nice to only do mediation once, and so maybe we should put that off for a while until we have a decision on whether the amended application needs to be renoticed or not. That might make it easier. I'm kind of scratching my head from a litigation perspective. If there's already been a mediation in a case and the parties have reached agreement, if I'm coming in late to a proceeding, and it would seem to put me in a pretty awkward position and put the others in kind of an awkward position, saying we all over here have an agreement and you're coming in late. And now it kind of looks like somebody's throwing rocks at an agreement. So I'm kind of leaning towards maybe we ought to put off mediation until we know who's interested in the amended application. And I sort of suspect it's the people that have been participating all along, but that may be incorrect.
Thank you, Mr. Berliner. I very much appreciate your thoughts and your experience with this and your concerns here. Mr. Schutz, I will turn to you next.
So I do think it's, of course, productive to continue to have what you might call offline conversations to try to narrow the issues among the existing parties, or if Elser Ranch decides that it's appropriate, among those who have shown interest but who are not parties to the proceeding as well. I do think that it might be in the interest of the ranch and of those of us who are parties to look at a mediation prior to any resubmitted or revised petition to amend, just in order to narrow the issues. And it might reduce or clarify the number of issues that may come up in future protests. And it also, I think, for those of us who've been living with this for, in some cases, 30 years, having to go and decide whether we have to articulate all of our issues over again, and not having had the opportunity to sort of simplify the chessboard, as it were, and reduce the number of issues to those that are clearly outstanding and that everyone understands are outstanding, might place a burden on those of us who've gone through this process for many years to write an more extensive kind of protest. So I think it'd be worth the investment of time to proceed with a mediation. And I'd recommend that if the ranch is willing, that it be open to those who've at least expressed interest, rather than be limited to the parties. But that would be a call between the ranch and the AHO.
Thank you, Mr. Schutz. Ms. Marie, I'll turn to you.
Thank you. I think CDFW is just concerned about potential more delay if mediation, if there isn't right now a final deadline for submitting the amended application, and then there's some future mediation after that. As Mr. Schutz said, we've been living with this for quite some time, and the resources have been suffering for quite some time, and I'm concerned about that continuing. Obviously, the partial draft settlement agreement is not working because we've observed the river drying up, And so we can't have that continue. And so we're concerned about continued delay. So to the extent that you can encourage the ranch to engage all the parties, state parks and all, sooner rather than later. And we believe we're fairly far apart, so mediation should not be scheduled for too long.
I'm sorry, Ms. Murray, would you please clarify that last statement for me?
We are very far apart in terms of what, I mean, the partial draft settlement agreement is not working. And so even emphasis on partial. And so we just don't believe it's worth spending many months in mediation. It's worth maybe a try, but we've already had a hearing and we need to move on.
Thank you, Ms. Murray. So I think based on this, which is very helpful, thank you to all of you for your input. What I'd like to do is keep that September 22nd deadline on the calendar for all of you, for Mr. Berliner, for you to meet with at least those parties who have identified themselves so far in this proceeding as parties. I would strongly encourage you to include Parks and Rec because they're here. And to try and narrow down or identify the topics that are still in dispute. And whether or not those topics end up being topics for mediation or whether they simply help me identify hearing issues, as that may be, I think that process itself will be productive and will be helpful and will move us in the right direction as an initial step. Now, whether we schedule the timing of mediation, I think we can address that at a later. I'd like to set the September 22nd deadline. I'd like to set a status conference for some point after that, and then make a decision about where we go next in terms of mediation. But I think this productive conversation over the next 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks would be helpful. And it will at least clarify whether there's agreement on the topics in dispute or whether there's a distance here that can't be overcome. Does that make sense to you, Mr. Berliner?
Well, at this point, yes, it does. I will reach out to the various folks, those that have been actively participating and those that are new to it. And we'll see how far we can get between now and the 22nd. I'm just thinking out loud again that I do appreciate that for some of the folks that we have not had a chance to speak with in the past, that date's pretty close. I'm not sure we can accomplish everything that we would hope to accomplish by then, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And I don't want to get into a substantive discussion today. I think we're being very process oriented, which is appropriate. I will just provide a reaction though, because the Department of Fish and Wildlife has now, I guess, twice made a statement that seems to allude to the river drying up with actions being taken by the applicant. And I would suggest there's really no evidence to that. And while the river has dried up, it dried up while the applicant was not pumping, is my understanding. So I don't want to get into it, is there or isn't there, but I would just note we have a different view than Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thank you, Mr. Berliner. So I think with that, I will memorialize in my status conference ruling the continued effect of the September 22nd deadline. I understand the caveats you mentioned, Mr. Berliner, about it is a short turnaround, but I encourage all of you to work together as diligently as possible to get something meaningful put together, which I think will be helpful. What I think I'd like to turn to next is setting a follow-up status conference date, which at a date that is fairly shortly after the 22nd, so we can check in once again. I think these are short meetings, but I do think they're helpful because we have so many pieces of this puzzle. It's helpful to check in and make sure we're moving forward on all the fronts. But before I do that, before we get out of our, well, you can get out your calendar, but before we turn to it, are there any other procedural issues that we should address today? In terms of a follow-up status conference, I have conflicts the entire week of September 26th, so that doesn't work for me. So I was looking to the following week, the first week of October. As an initial proposal, I had marked down Tuesday, October 4th at 1 p.m. So I'll put that out there as just an initial trial balloon, if you will. Would October 4th at 1 p.m. Does anyone have a irreconcilable conflict for that date and time? Okay, so I will plan to schedule I will issue a notice for a status conference on October 4th at 1 p.m. At that point, we'll follow up on what we're calling mediation issues, but it may be more accurate to refer to them as issues in dispute. Let's call them mediation issues for now, but we may change those, change the title of it, change the nature of it. And then I'll follow up if there's anything else on measurement and reporting that we need to discuss based on what you see in my ruling that comes out today, or if there are any other questions that come up in terms of amending the application or technical questions. Mr. Berliner, this status conference may be a good opportunity if there's a need for a meeting of the engineers or anything like that. We could use this date and time to do that. So we will hold this date and time for all of those purposes. Is there anything else we should talk about today before we adjourn? Well, with that, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your thoughts. I think this was constructive, and you will see a ruling coming out of this office shortly that memorializes our conversation. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.